The best place to start is with a fundamental question. What is study circles? At its core, study circles is a community engagement and learning process. But that's not a particularly helpful definition, as there are lots of such processes such as asset-based community development, appreciative inquiry, and citizen juries. Each of these processes has their own focus and strengths. If you're interested in learning more, organizations such as the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation has a brief explanation of many different engagement processes out there. For our purposes, we felt that study circles provided a useful process that aligned well with the goals of capacity building and community engagement. So let's dive into study circles more specifically. There are a few helpful introductory videos about study circles on the Our Town, Our Kids website already that provide a general overview of study circle processes, the facilitator role, and participant involvement. I encourage you to check these out. But for the too long didn't watch version, let's define study circles as a facilitated communication process that brings together diverse stakeholders to study, learn, and make decisions about an issue using experiential and other data. This definition frames the work of both the planning group and the facilitators. So before we get into the work of the planning group and facilitators, let's go through each element of the study circles definition and unpack its implications, beginning with communication. First, study circles is about communication. Communication obviously has special resonance for me as a communication professor, but I want to pause here because I think we sometimes take communication for granted, and that could be detrimental when thinking about this process. I many times see this tendency to think of communication as simply the messages we send. We might stick an S on the end of the word and talk about sending communications. This is one way to think about it, and it's a common way that managers, public information officers, and other groups think about it. It's also rooted in what's called the SMCR model of communication, where you have the sender, the message, the channel, and the receiver. In this model, we might think of a game of ping pong between a sender and a receiver, or we might equate communication to a dart you're trying to throw to hit a particular mark. The risk in conflating communication and messages, though, is that it risks missing all the other components of communication, including feedback, noise, and context in which this interaction is occurring. There are all sorts of types of noise, including semantic noise, where there is confusion about the wording being used. There's noise such as psychological noise, which comes from the thoughts that folks are having while they're interacting with someone else. There's cultural noise, which is the noise that happens when there is a mismatch of cultural values, beliefs, and ways of doing things. And all of those come into play when we are interacting with one another. Another common but reductionist way people may see communication is simply the output of the real work that happens between the ears. For example, we can focus on things like mindset, which is a helpful concept. But if the focus stops there, there's a risk of not recognizing the impact of the social or the interactional, as these are powerful in shaping how we define ourselves, our relationships, one another, and beyond. The bottom line is that it's helpful to remember that communication does things and communication makes things. We have to be attentive to the relationships, communities, and organizations we're creating through our communication. We have to be attentive to our words, our nonverbals, our networks, and our media. So when you think about study circles as a communication process, it's important to remember that people are evaluating the way they're being treated by one another, which we would call interactional justice. Study circles is about creating relationships, deepening knowledge, and making decisions through communication that is characterized by dialogic and deliberative thinking and listening and meeting. Communication makes study circles what they are, which means planning groups and facilitators need to be attentive to their own communication and their influence on participants' communication. So second, in addition to communication, study circle processes require facilitation. We were fortunate that this OTOK effort was enhanced by the work of skilled facilitators who knew their communities and their different dynamics. Skilled facilitators know how to help people express themselves, ask questions, listen deeply, and make sense out of new, sometimes conflicting information. Skilled facilitators are vital for enhancing people's sense of justice, including procedural justice by protecting and enhancing people's voice, interactional justice by ensuring respectful interaction, informational justice by helping to draw out and center good information when it comes to decision-making, and distributive justice by facilitating those good decision-making practices. So a third element of study circles, along with communication and facilitation, is participation. Study circles is designed to bring people from diverse backgrounds together to learn about and act on the issue at hand. We'll get to specific numbers and recruitment here in a bit, but suffice it to say that it's important that there are multiple perspectives and experiences around the table, as much of the work of the first study circle is dedicated to sharing personal experiences and helping participants to get to know one another and how they make sense of the world. This sharing of personal experiences, in turn, is important for self-disclosure and what it means to build trust and strong relationships with one another. Because topics such as juvenile justice are multidimensional, you need to have people who can give voice to those different dimensions, and you need facilitators who can help to protect those voices, even when those voices are surfacing ideas that may be uncomfortable to some. The final element to cover in terms of the focus of study circles is decision-making, specifically data-based decision-making. This is where study circles shine. Study circles are designed so that people not only share and learn from one another's personal experiences, but also learn from data that already exists on the issue. This data can be numeric or statistical data. This data may be narrative or interview-based data, or it could be other types of data. The idea is that each study circle, people listen comprehensively and empathically to new information, even information that conflicts with their already existing beliefs, to grow their understanding of the issue. They can ask for more information and data, which is then provided to them by the planning group for them to consider in making their own recommendations and decisions. So to sum up, study circles have at least 4 points of emphasis: communication, facilitation, participation, and data-based decision-making. Each of these elements influence the work of 2 key groups that have significant roles to play: the planning group and the facilitator group. I want to pause here for a reflection moment. I'll ask a question, and in your notes you can jot down answers to the question and even other questions that come to mind. So here's the question. Are there people in your community who you think would be interested in participating in this type of process, particularly about juvenile justice? Go ahead and list them while the music plays for about 45 seconds or a minute, and then by their name, write a couple of words as to why you think they might be interested. We'll come back to this list in a moment. Okay, now that you have a sense of people in your communities for whom this process would resonate, let's dive into some of the technical aspects, starting with the planning group and its responsibilities. The planning group consists of about 6 to 10 people who organize and guide the study circle effort. It's important that this group is representative of various perspectives, positions, and skill sets. This diversity helps on several fronts. First, it makes the effort more well-rounded rather than monolithic. Second, it enhances the perceived legitimacy of the effort. And third, it's helpful when it comes to recruiting. And fourth, it helps to ensure that multiple perspectives are identified and protected. The planning group needs to be comfortable expressing conflicting perspectives and working through such conflict well, identifying points of tension, and developing effective processes for people to engage directly with one another on those tensions helps the group to model what it wants circle participants to do. So as you think about what goes into a good planning group, perhaps some of the people you listed in the exercise you just did would be good planning members. It may be helpful to put a little star by their names on that list. The planning group has a number of responsibilities, including framing the core issue to be explored, identifying the connected issues for discussion in the circles, getting the data on the various issues for the participants, laying out meeting timelines, recruiting participants, orienting facilitators to the work, and a number of other miscellaneous responsibilities. So let's briefly touch on those 7 key activities for the group. First, the group is responsible for framing the overarching question. Framing is about using language in a way that highlights some elements and backgrounds other elements. In conflict management, we often talk about framing as a key strategic activity in which people highlight their interpretation of the issue. It is absolutely vital at this formative stage to resist the temptation to skew the conversation in a particular way by framing the overarching question to align with certain interests. For example, rather than frame the issue as, the purpose of our study circles effort is to find ways to problem solve youth and their parents, you would do better to frame the issue first as an open question and second in a way that opens space for many voices. Something like, what are different factors in our community that should be addressed in order to carry out effective juvenile justice efforts? Now, this isn't a perfect framing, but the idea is that you're trying to be intentional about opening up spaces for multiple voices because there are multiple voices in your community. A second activity for the planning group is to map the different dimensions of the issue. This process of issue mapping helps the group to identify those processes or phenomena connected to its overarching question. For example, for the OTOK effort, we looked at topics like disproportionate minority contact, the experiences of LGBTQI youth, trauma, and decision points. Those are but a partial list of issues connected to juvenile justice and working with system-involved youth and their families. It's incumbent on the planning group to identify dimensions of the issue that are relevant and important, even if some of those issues won't be popular, and structure conversation and data around those dimensions. A third key activity, once the question and issues have been identified, is to work hard to find all the valid and reliable data it can get its hands on, plan for how to package the data for participants to study, and then train facilitators on how to guide conversation around the data. This is where partnerships with researchers and universities can be really helpful, as they may have quicker and less costly access to the data and can help with interpreting the data. So this search for data is not a once and done activity. The planning group will be engaged in data collection throughout the process as it responds to the data requests of participants after each study circle and potentially during each study circle. This is also why it's important to have a good note taker in the room, as planning groups will need to review transcripts and notes after each circle to keep up to date with needs, concerns, questions, and the like of participants and facilitators. A fourth key activity, concurrent with data collection, is to lay out the timeline for the meetings. You typically want to allow for about 6 weeks between circles to be responsive to participants' data requests. This is where having someone on the planning committee who's good with logistics is very helpful. During the intervening weeks, planning group members and facilitators should conduct periodic check-ins with participants not only to maintain participation and interest, but also to ask diagnostic questions about how the effort is going and what changes could be made to improve or adapt the process to participants' needs. A fifth key element involves recruitment. Typically, circles have about 8 to 12 participants. If circles are overly small, discussion is really choppy and the wide range of views doesn't get explored. If it gets overly large, some voices likely will be drowned out. In our situation, we had a couple of groups of more than 12. In those cases, it's best to have co-facilitators who can be responsive and engage people who might be quieter. There are a number of decision points in the recruiting process that the planning group will have to work through and make sure that they're on the same page about. For example, do you recruit certain people in prominent positions, even though their presence might shut down disagreement and promote groupthink? Groupthink being the tendency for people to suppress disagreement in order to maintain their relationships with others in the group. This is why at Study Circle 1, it's important to set the ground rules for what's going to happen so that we set the expectations of listening, not interrupting, and making sure that we're treating everyone with respect. These are some important factors to consider when trying to identify not only who to recruit, but who to have as facilitators. It could be helpful to begin to develop a participant map similar to this one that you can use to think through the representativeness and relationships among participants. A sixth key activity is training facilitators. Having trained facilitators who are comfortable with the material and who are empowered to facilitate in ways that they are comfortable is absolutely essential. You also want a note taker to help with setting up any devices such as recorders so that the facilitator can focus on relationships and interaction in the room. While bringing in facilitators from outside the community can be helpful for promoting perceived neutrality, you may instead want someone from the inside of the community because of their understanding of community dynamics. There are advantages and disadvantages with going with outside facilitators who may have training as facilitators and going with community members who may be closer to the community but may need more training on the front end. Ideally, of course, you would have trained facilitators who also are community members. Regardless, the question of facilitation is an important decision that the planning group needs to make. Facilitators should be prepared to guide decision-making processes, help participants to avoid decision-making pitfalls like groupthink, and engage in productive conflict with one another, remembering that conflict is not necessarily bad. In fact, task conflict has been shown to be associated with greater group productivity. It's the relational conflict that tends to be counterproductive for groups. And it's important for facilitators to be comfortable managing and identifying those different types of conflict. There are also a number of miscellaneous considerations to keep in mind for the planning group when doing this effort. For example, do you have a place to share information among planning members and facilitators and between facilitators and participants? We used our OTOK website and various internal tools to try to manage information, and this was a significant undertaking. Another consideration is whether you're wanting to publicize the event. Who do you want to know that this effort is happening? Depending on where you are and the salience of the issue, media outlets may be interested. If so, do you have a policy on media access? It's likely best to insulate the discussion so that people will feel freer to share. You need trust to promote self-disclosure. Another consideration is that of materials needed to run the meetings. Facilitation and flip charts go hand in hand. They're useful for capturing and presenting ideas. You may also want side door methods of communicating, such as note cards that enable anonymous feedback or questions, sticky dots that people can put on flip charts as a kind of voting mechanism, a projector, laptop, pens, markers, anything that you think would help people to be able to be meaningfully involved in the discussion at hand. And of course, food. Meetings just simply run better with food. Another consideration is location. You want it to be easy to access and have space for private conversation. Wi-Fi is not a bad idea either. You might also consider post-meeting surveys that people can use to give feedback and ask questions they weren't comfortable asking in front of everyone. It's a good way to be self-reflective and make sure you're accomplishing your goals. So to sum up, planning groups have a lot of work to do. Study circles is a process that brings a diverse set of participants to the table to study an issue from multiple perspectives, communicate dialogically and deliberatively about those issues, and arrive at a plan. So let's pause right here for questions and answers, and then for the final unit, Mackenzie and Elaine will join to discuss the lessons that emerge from the project that are particularly relevant for facilitation.